First story. The Alien Courier. I've been a trucker for over a decade now, and I like to think I've seen it all. I've handled breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, driven through blizzards that felt like they'd never end, and even had my fair share of eerie late-night encounters on empty highways. But nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what I've been dealing with for the past 6 months. At first it was subtle stuff, things I could almost chalk up to exhaustion. You know how it is when you're driving long stretches, your mind starts to wander. But this wasn't like zoning out and forgetting a couple of miles. This was big. Chunks of time, gone. I'd leave a truck stop around midnight. Next thing I knew, it was 3 hours later, and I'd be parked on the side of the road with no idea how I got there. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Just getting older, I told myself. Brain's playing tricks. But then it started happening more often, and it wasn't funny anymore. One time, I woke up in my truck to find my cargo had been unloaded, but I had zero memory of getting to the destination. My logbook was filled out, my rig was locked up, and everything looked normal. But I swear on my life, I didn't remember a second of it. That's when I started getting scared. I mean, truckers have strict regulations about rest, and I wasn't messing around with those. I was sleeping, eating right, doing everything by the book. So what was happening to me during these blackouts? The turning point came during a route from Nevada to Oregon. I'd done this run countless times before. It was a straight shot through mostly empty desert. Easy money. I left a rest stop around 11 p.m., my coffee hot in the cup holder and a podcast playing quietly to keep me alert. Next thing I knew, I was standing outside my truck, staring at the vast emptiness of the desert. The engine was off, the stars were blindingly bright, and there wasn't a single sound except the wind. My phone said it was 3:37 a.m. That meant I'd been gone, mentally at least, for over 4 hours. My stomach churned as I climbed back into the cab, trying to piece things together. The weirdest part, there were footprints in the sand around my truck, but they weren't mine. I wish I could say I turned on the engine and got the hell out of there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out again, following the prints for about 20 feet before they just stopped. Like whoever, or whatever, made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight beam flickering, over the empty sand, half expecting something to leap out of the darkness. Eventually I gave up and got back in my truck, but the uneasiness stuck with me. When I checked my cargo at the next stop, everything looked fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something I didn't understand. After that night, I started paying closer attention. I got myself a dash cam and even set up a voice recorder in the cab, hoping to catch anything strange happening during my blackouts. It didn't take long for the weirdness to escalate. On my next trip, the dash cam recorded nothing but static for 3 hours straight, right in the middle of one of my missing time episodes. It wasn't just a glitch either. Everything before and after those 3 hours was perfectly clear. I checked the voice recorder, and that's when things got even stranger. There was this low hum, almost like an engine idling, but deeper, more mechanical. And then came the voices. They weren't human. They were speaking in this language I can't even begin to describe, like clicking and buzzing mixed with something electronic. I swear I felt my heart stop when I heard it. I couldn't figure out what to do with the recordings. Who do you even tell about something like this? I thought about going to the cops, but what would I say? Hey, I think aliens are hijacking my truck. They'd lock me up for sure, so I kept it to myself, hoping it was just some freaky coincidence. But the more it happened, the harder it was to deny that something beyond my understanding was going on. One night, after another blackout, I found a strange, silvery residue on the floor of the trailer. It shimmered under the flashlight, almost like liquid mercury, but it was dry to the touch. I tried to wipe it off with a rag, but it left this faint, almost glowing stain on the metal. I didn't know it at the time, but that residue was the key to figuring out what was really happening. To me, things really went off the rails on a run through Arizona. It was a route I knew like the back of my hand, and I wasn't expecting any surprises. But halfway through, I started to feel that familiar fog creeping in, like my mind was shutting down without my permission. I fought it, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, blasting cold air in my face, anything to stay alert. Then, all at once, it was like I blinked, and everything changed. The truck was still moving, but I wasn't driving anymore. The steering wheel was turning on its own, the pedals moving under phantom pressure. I tried to grab control, but it was like the truck wasn't even mine anymore. What I saw outside the windshield still haunts me. The highway was gone. Instead, the truck was barreling down this glowing metallic tunnel like something out of a sci-fi movie. The walls pulsed with light, and there were these strange shapes moving just out of view. They weren't cars or animals, more like shadows with too many limbs, gliding along the edges of the tunnel. I was frozen, my hands hovering over the wheel, completely useless. My brain kept screaming that this wasn't real, but my body knew it was. The hum from the recordings was back, only louder now, vibrating through my entire body. That's when I saw them, these figures standing in the middle of the tunnel, waiting. I couldn't make out much detail at first, just their silhouettes against the glowing walls. They were tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen, and their limbs looked impossibly long and thin. As the truck got closer, I noticed their heads were elongated, almost cone-shaped, with no clear features. Just smooth, dark surfaces that seemed to absorb the light around them. I wanted to scream, to hit the brakes, to do anything, but it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. My hands were frozen in midair, and I could barely breathe. The truck slowed down on its own, rolling to a stop right in front of them. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. No hum, no engine, nothing. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, raising an arm-like appendage. It wasn't a hand, not really, but something extended from it, a glowing rod or tool of some kind. That's when the trailer doors flew open with a metallic clang that echoed through the tunnel. I felt the entire rig shudder as something heavy was lifted out of the trailer. Whatever it was, I couldn't see it clearly. It was almost like my eyes refused to focus on it, like my brain couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. The figures moved methodically, like they'd done this 100 times before. I could feel vibrations through the floor of the cab as they worked, and every now and then, that eerie buzzing language filled the air. It was coming from them. I was sure of it. My body finally started to respond, and I tried to move my arm to grab my phone. But the second I twitched, the nearest figure turned its head toward me. I don't know how I could tell, but it felt like it was staring right into me, even though it didn't have eyes. That was enough to freeze me in place again. After what felt like an eternity, they finished whatever they were doing. The trailer doors slammed shut, and the truck began to move again without me touching a thing. The glowing tunnel dissolved around me, and suddenly I was back on the highway, the stars bright and the desert stretching out endlessly on either side. The clock on my dashboard said it was 4:12 a.m. Nearly 3 hours had passed, and I had no memory of anything except the terrifying moments I'd just experienced. I pulled over at the next truck stop, shaking so badly I could barely park. When I finally managed to climb out of the cab, I checked the trailer. Everything was perfectly sealed, no signs of damage or tampering. But there was one thing, more, of that silvery residue smeared along the edges of the doors like fingerprints. I spent hours at that truck stop just sitting in the cab with the engine off, trying to make sense of what had happened. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures again, looming over me. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who? My family wouldn't believe me. My coworkers would think I'd finally lost it. And the company, they'd probably fire me on the spot. So I sat there, staring at the residue on the trailer doors, wondering if I was losing my mind. Eventually, I forced myself to get back on the road. I had to finish the job, even though every fiber of my being wanted to turn the truck around and leave the whole damn load in the desert. When I finally reached my delivery point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The warehouse workers didn't seem surprised to see me, even though I was several hours late. Usually, someone would give me hell for holding up their schedule. But this time, they just unloaded the trailer in silence, barely even looking at me. As I drove away, I realized I'd forgotten to check what was in the shipment. I pulled over a few miles down the road and checked the paperwork. It listed some generic industrial materials, nothing that explained the silvery residue or the strange events. But then I noticed a stamp in the corner of the page, a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like a series of interlocking circles, almost like a fractal. I had never seen anything like it before, and just looking at it gave me this weird, uneasy feeling. I couldn't let it go. The symbol, the residue, the blackouts, it all felt connected, like I was part of something much bigger than I could understand. I started keeping detailed notes of every trip, tracking when the blackouts happened, what I was hauling, and where I was going. Patterns began to emerge, but they didn't make sense. The deliveries always seemed to happen in remote areas, often near military bases or facilities with high security, and the cargo, it was always something mundane on paper, machinery parts, construction supplies, things that wouldn't raise any red flags, but every time there was that residue, faint but unmistakable, as if the real cargo had nothing to do with what was on the manifest. The recordings weren't much help either. The static and buzzing language showed up every time, but there was no clear footage of the blackouts or the figures. The only thing I had was my own memory, which was unreliable at best. Then one night, I woke up in my truck in the middle of a field. The GPS showed I was over 200 miles off course. My head was pounding, and my hands were covered in the same silvery substance. I stumbled out of the cab and found the trailer doors wide open, completely empty. There were scorch marks on the ground around the truck, like something had been burned into the dirt. That's when I realized this wasn't just happening to me, it was happening because of me. After that night, I became obsessed with finding answers. I started digging through old trucker forums, reading about strange sightings on highways and unexplained phenomena during long hauls. To my surprise, there were others who'd experienced things like I had, missing time, strange substances, and even sightings of unidentified figures. Some of them chalked it up to exhaustion or overactive imaginations, but a few described events that felt eerily similar to mine. One post stood out. It was from a guy claiming to have worked for a government contractor. He mentioned interdimensional logistics and how certain truckers were unknowingly being used to transport materials that couldn't exist in our reality for long. It sounded insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. I reached out to him through private messages, and to my shock, he responded almost immediately. He didn't give his name, just said he'd been involved in the logistics side of things, and warned me to stop asking questions. He claimed that the silvery residue was a byproduct of dimensional shifts, and that the blackouts were a side effect of the process. When I pressed him for more details, he went quiet. The next time I tried to message him, his account was deleted. It felt like I'd hit a dead end, but at the same time, it confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't all in my head. The real tipping point came on a delivery to a small, isolated town in Utah. The instructions were vague, just an address with no business name. The GPS led me to a fenced-off facility surrounded by dense woods. It didn't look like a normal delivery spot. No loading docks, no signs, just a gate with a keypad. When I buzzed in, a distorted voice gave me a code and told me to back the trailer into a covered area. I couldn't see much beyond the gate, but there were cameras everywhere, all pointed at me. The place had an air of secrecy that made my skin crawl. Once the trailer was unloaded, I was handed a sealed envelope and told to leave immediately. The guy who gave it to me didn't look like a warehouse worker. He was wearing a suit and his face was expressionless, almost too perfect, like he didn't belong there. As I pulled away, I couldn't resist opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with that same interlocking circle symbol, along with a warning. Stop asking questions. My heart sank. They knew I'd been digging, and now they were letting me know they were watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head, but the more they tried to scare me off, the more determined I became to uncover the truth. I tried to act normal after that, but it wasn't easy. Every time I took a job, I wondered if it would be the last one. I started noticing unmarked cars tailing me on the highway, always staying just far enough back that I couldn't make out who was inside. My phone would act up constantly. Dropped calls, random static, apps freezing for no reason. At night, when I parked at rest stops, I'd get this overwhelming sense that I was being watched. It got so bad that I started sleeping with a wrench under my seat, just in case. But nothing prepared me for what happened on my last delivery. This time, the route was from Colorado to a facility in Wyoming. It was another one of those mysterious jobs with a nondescript address and minimal paperwork. I figured it would be like the others, drop the trailer, collect my fee, and try not to think too hard about what I'd just delivered. But halfway through the drive, I felt it again, that fog creeping into my mind. I knew a blackout was coming, and no matter how much I fought it, it hit me like a freight train. When I came to, I was in the middle of an empty parking lot. The trailer was gone, and my cab was spotless, too spotless. The silvery residue wasn't just gone. It looked like someone had cleaned every inch of the truck, even places I hadn't touched. I sat there in the cab trying to process what had just happened. My head was pounding, and my hands felt like they'd been dipped in ice water. The GPS was blank, showing no signal, and my phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged before the trip. As I stepped out to get my bearings, I realized I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the pale light of a nearby street lamp. My chest tightened as I stared at them. They weren't moving, just standing there watching me. I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, they started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, their movements almost mechanical. As they got closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was one of them. The elongated limbs, the smooth, featureless head. It was exactly like the figures I'd seen in the tunnel. I scrambled back into the cab and locked the doors, fumbling to start the engine. The figure stopped just short of the truck, tilting its head like it was studying me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, leaving me gasping for breath and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. My hands were shaking so bad that I could barely keep the truck steady on the road. I drove for hours without stopping, not caring where I was headed as long as it was far away from that parking lot. By the time I pulled into a gas station, the sun was starting to rise, and I was completely drained. I sat there in the cab for what felt like an eternity, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like hell. Dark circles under my eyes, pale as a ghost. But something else caught my attention. My eyes weren't just bloodshot. They were rimmed with faint streaks of silver, like the residue that kept showing up after my blackouts. Panic set in as I splashed water on my face in the restroom, trying to wash it away, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't just on my skin, it felt like it was in me. I couldn't help but wonder if this was what the truck was carrying all along. Not just physical cargo, but something alive, something that was slowly leaving its mark on me. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Was I being used as more than just a driver? Were they changing me somehow? The thought made my stomach turn, but there was no one I could talk to, no way to make sense of it all. I decided that was it. No more deliveries, no more blackouts, no more alien encounters. I called my dispatcher and told him I was done. He didn't argue, just said understood and hung up. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Something about his tone felt off, like he wasn't surprised at all. I packed up my stuff and drove straight home, determined to leave the whole nightmare behind me. But the weirdness followed me. At night, I'd wake up to strange noises outside my house. Low hums and faint clicking sounds, just like the recordings from the truck. Once, I even found a small patch of that silvery residue on my front porch, glowing faintly under the moonlight. The final straw came a week later. I was going through my dashcam footage, hoping to delete it and forget everything, when I noticed something I'd never seen before. In the moments right before one of my blackouts, there was a frame, a single, split-second image of one of the figures standing next to my truck. It was blurry but unmistakable. My hands went numb as I stared at the screen, and that's when I knew this wasn't over. They'd let me leave the job, sure, but I was still part of whatever they were doing. Maybe I always would be. The strangest thing is, after I quit, the blackout stopped. No more lost hours, no more waking up in strange places. But the dreams, they haven't gone away. Every night I see glimpses of that glowing tunnel, the figures standing in the darkness, and the cargo, always shifting, always something my mind refuses to comprehend. I can't shake the feeling that they planted something in me, something I can't see or understand. Some nights I wake up gasping for air, feeling like I'm still behind the wheel of that truck, driving down a highway that doesn't exist. I've started avoiding mirrors too. Sometimes I swear I catch a flicker of silver deep in my eyes, just for a second. I've thought about going to a doctor, getting scans done, but what would I even say? I think I've been transporting alien cargo, and now I'm not sure if I'm fully human anymore. Yeah, that would go over well. So I keep it to myself, trying to live a normal life, even though I know I'll never really escape it. The weirdest part? Every now and then, I'll get a call from an unknown number. No one speaks, but I can hear that faint buzzing noise on the other end. I don't answer anymore. I just let it ring until it stops. I don't know what they wanted from me, or why they chose me in the first place. Maybe they picked me because I was just another anonymous trucker, someone who wouldn't be missed if things went wrong. Or maybe I agreed to it once and just don't remember. That's the scariest thought of all. Did I sign up for this? Was there ever a choice? I'll probably never know. Lately, I've been thinking about hitting the road again. Not for work, but to retrace my old roots, see if I can find any answers. Something deep down tells me it's a bad idea. But another part of me, maybe the part they touched, wants to understand. Every time I see a truck like mine on the highway, I wonder if the driver knows what they're really hauling. If they feel that same creeping unease when they check their logbooks and find hours they can't account for. If they've noticed the residue. Maybe I'm not the only one. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Second story, the visitor in my basement. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share something like this online, but I honestly don't know what else to do. It happened about 3 weeks ago, and I still can't wrap my head around it. I live alone in a small, older house that I inherited from my grandmother. It's nothing special, just a creaky old place with too much space for one person. The basement, though, always creeped me out. It's one of those unfinished ones with exposed pipes and a weird, musty smell that never really goes away no matter how much I clean. I usually avoid going down there unless I absolutely have to, like when the circuit breaker trips or I need to grab something from storage. That night, I had no choice. The power had flickered a couple of times and then, boom, out. Completely. I grabbed my flashlight and reluctantly made my way downstairs, already feeling that familiar unease creeping up my spine. The air was heavier than usual, and for some reason, I could swear I heard breathing. Not mine. Something else. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. The old pipes always made weird noises, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But as I stepped further into the basement, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the corners filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture covered in dusty sheets. That's when I saw it. A shape, hunched and trembling, wedged between the water heater and the wall. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It wasn't human, that much I knew right away. The figure was small, with elongated limbs and skin that looked almost translucent under the beam of my flashlight. But what really got me were its eyes. Huge, dark, and filled with something I didn't expect. Fear. It wasn't just watching me. It was pleading with me. I could see it in the way it clutched its hands, its thin chest rising and falling rapidly. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something in me held back. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at something, terrified. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. The flashlight shook slightly in my hand, casting shaky beams of light across the damp concrete floor. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around and run up those stairs, slam the door shut, and never look back. But I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed with fear, though I was, but because something about the way it looked at me made my stomach twist in a way I can't explain. It wasn't menacing. It wasn't hostile. It was desperate. Its long, spindly fingers gripped at its own body like it was trying to hold itself together, its chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I could see patches of what looked like bruises or burns on its strange, pale skin, and a deep gash running down its left arm. Without thinking, I took a step closer, and the creature flinched, pressing itself harder against the wall. I whispered something. I don't even remember what, but my voice came out shaky and unsure. It didn't respond, just stared at me, with those enormous glassy eyes that seemed to reflect every ounce of fear it felt. I crouched down slowly, keeping a few feet of distance between us, and I realized I was holding my breath. What the hell was I supposed to do? Call the cops? Run? Help it? My mind was spinning in a million directions at once, and all I could do was stay there, staring at something that shouldn't even exist. Then, very slowly, it reached out one trembling hand toward me, palm up, like it was asking for something, anything. And for some insane reason, instead of recoiling, I felt this overwhelming need to help it. I don't know what came over me, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only thing I had on me, a crumpled tissue. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it, but I extended it toward the creature anyway, not even sure why. It didn't take it. Instead, it just looked at me, those wide, unblinking eyes locked onto mine like it was trying to understand what I was doing. Up close, I could see the way its skin almost shimmered under the flashlight, like it wasn't meant to be seen in this kind of light. It was breathing fast, shallow, and I could tell it was in pain. There was this strange sound coming from it, something between a whimper and a clicking noise, and it made my stomach turn in the worst way. I knew right then that whatever this thing was, it was suffering. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. Everything in my brain screamed that this shouldn't be happening, that I should be running out of there, calling someone, doing something. But instead, I stayed. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, still holding out the tissue, and whispered, "It's okay." My voice sounded alien in my own ears, weak and uncertain, but the creature blinked, slowly, like it was processing what I said. And then it did something I wasn't expecting. It reached toward me, its fingers hovering inches from mine, and I could feel the heat radiating off its skin. It was trembling. I wasn't sure if it was from fear or exhaustion, but either way, I could feel the fear radiating off it like a wave. I don't know how long we sat there like that, both of us frozen in place, neither of us sure what to do next. The basement felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in on us, and I could hear the hum of the house settling above us, something that usually comforted me, but now felt suffocating. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't even begin to answer. Where did it come from? How long had it been hiding down here? And the scariest thought of all was something else looking for it. I could feel the weight of that question settling in my chest like a rock. The creature's breathing was slowing down now, and I could see it watching me with a kind of cautious hope, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I wanted to ask it so many things, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I gestured toward its injured arm, pointing at the gash. It flinched again, but didn't pull away this time. I took that as a sign, and carefully reached out, my fingers hovering just above its skin. It felt wrong. Not in a gross way, but in a way that told me it didn't belong here, like touching something that shouldn't exist in this world. I pressed the tissue gently against the wound, and it let out a sharp, shuddering breath, its whole body tensing. I muttered an apology, feeling ridiculous for talking to it like it could understand me, but somehow, I think it did. As I pressed the tissue against its wound, I felt the thin, almost fragile texture of its skin beneath my fingers. It was warmer than I expected, almost feverish, and I could tell it was in pain. The creature winced but didn't pull away, which I took as some sort of trust, if you could call it that. My heart was still pounding, but I started to focus more on the immediate situation rather than the sheer impossibility of it all. The cut on its arm was deep, but there was no blood. At least not like anything I'd seen before. Instead, there was a thick, dark fluid that oozed out slowly, almost like sap from a tree. The smell hit me a second later. Something metallic, but also off. It made my stomach churn, but I swallowed down the nausea and kept my hands steady. As I worked, the creature's breathing slowed, and it watched me with those huge, dark eyes, still wary but calmer. I didn't realize how close we were until I felt its breath on my wrist, shallow and rapid. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. I don't know what made me do it, but I whispered, "You're okay." It blinked again, slowly, like it was processing my words, and for the first time I saw something, almost human in its expression. A flicker of relief, maybe. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The basement felt colder all of a sudden, and I could hear the wind outside rattling against the old windows upstairs. I was acutely aware of how alone I was in that house. No neighbors close by, no one to call for help even if I wanted to. And for the first time, I wondered if this thing had been here longer than I realized. Had I been living above it all this time, completely unaware? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around the basement, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows, and I spotted something I hadn't noticed before. An old blanket I'd stuffed in a corner months ago when cleaning. Slowly I reached over and grabbed it, then carefully draped it over the creature. It flinched but didn't resist. It curled into itself, its elongated limbs folding in ways that made my skin crawl, but beneath all that it just looked exhausted, vulnerable. I sat down against the wall, still keeping a bit of distance, and tried to collect my thoughts. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't exactly take it to a hospital. I couldn't just leave it here and pretend I hadn't seen it. And what if, God, what if someone else was looking for it? The thought made my pulse quicken, and for the first time, I felt something new creeping in alongside the fear. A deep, unsettling sense of responsibility. I sat there for what felt like hours, my back against the cold concrete wall, staring at this thing, this being, huddled under the blanket. The basement had always felt eerie to me, but now it felt different. Not just unsettling, but like it held secrets I wasn't meant to know. My mind kept racing in circles, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing it? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, the reality of what was in front of me was undeniable. The creature, whatever it was real, and it needed help. Every so often, it would shift slightly, letting out these soft, clicking noises that sent chills up my spine. I wasn't sure if it was trying to communicate or if it was just in pain, but either way, the sound made me uneasy. I thought about going upstairs, locking the basement door, and pretending none of this had happened. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do that. I couldn't just leave it down here alone and injured. And besides, a part of me was afraid that if I left, it wouldn't be there when I came back. That thought scared me more than anything. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, my legs stiff from sitting on the hard floor for so long. The creature tensed, watching me closely, but didn't move. I took a few cautious steps toward the stairs, my flashlight still in hand, and paused. "I'll be back," I muttered, not even sure why I was talking to it like it could understand. Maybe I was trying to reassure myself more than anything. As I climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaked under my weight, and I half expected to hear something following me. But when I reached the top and glanced back, it was still there, curled up under the blanket watching me. I shut the basement door carefully, locking it behind me, and leaned against it, my mind spinning. My house felt different now, every shadow a little darker, every sound a little sharper. I stood there for a long time, listening, half expecting to hear footsteps or scratching from below. Nothing. Just the wind rattling the windows and the distant hum of the fridge. I needed to figure out what to do next. My phone was upstairs, but who was I supposed to call? The police? Animal control? NASA? The thought almost made me laugh, but it wasn't funny. Nothing about this was funny. I paced around my kitchen, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. What if it wasn't alone? What if something worse was out there looking for it? The idea made my stomach churn. I peeked out the window into the backyard, half expecting to see strange lights in the sky or shadowy figures lurking among the trees. But everything looked normal, eerily normal. The hum of the fridge and the ticking of the old wall clock were the only sounds keeping me grounded in reality. I thought about calling someone, but the thought of trying to explain what was in my basement made my throat tighten. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd come and take it away. And despite how terrifying this whole situation was, a strange sense of protectiveness had started creeping in. I grabbed a bottle of water and a box of granola bars from the counter, hesitating before heading back downstairs. My hands were still shaking when I unlocked the door, and with every step down, I half expected it to have disappeared, like it had never been there to begin with. But it was. Huddled under the blanket, its dark eyes locked onto me the second I appeared, wary but hopeful. I sat down slowly, placing the water and granola bars on the floor between us, unsure if it could even eat or drink. It stared at them, then at me, and after a long pause, it reached out cautiously. The way it handled the water bottle was almost human. Its long fingers fumbled with the cap, and after a few awkward attempts, it gave up, looking at me in a way that I could only describe as frustrated. Without thinking, I reached over and twisted the cap off, handing it back to it carefully. It took a slow, hesitant sip, and for the first time, I realized just how dry and cracked its skin looked, like it had been dehydrated for a long time. I didn't even know if it was safe for it to drink, but it didn't seem to care. It gulped down the water, and I could hear it breathing easier afterward. I watched in quiet fascination as it examined the granola bar next, turning it over in its hands like it was trying to figure it out. I opened one for it, breaking a small piece off and holding it out. It hesitated, then snatched it from my hand, chewing slowly, its expression unreadable. I sat back against the cold wall, my heart still pounding, but there was something almost peaceful about the moment. In the dim glow of my flashlight, it looked less alien and more like something lost, something that didn't belong here and had nowhere else to go. And in a way, I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. As it ate, I couldn't help but notice the way its hands trembled, like it hadn't had food in a long time, or maybe ever. The way it moved, the way it observed every little thing I did, made me wonder just how long it had been hiding down here. Had it been surviving off scraps, water from the leaking pipes? The thought made my chest tighten. I watched as it finished the granola bar in small, careful bites, chewing, in a slow, deliberate way that almost seemed cautious, like it wasn't sure if it could trust the food. I realized I was staring, and I quickly looked away, my mind running wild with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. What was it? Where had it come from? And why the hell did it seem so afraid? Every few moments, it would glance at the basement door, like it was expecting something, or someone, to come crashing through at any second. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just scared of me, it was hiding from something. I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling more exposed than ever. Whatever it was running from, what if it found its way here? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I shifted uncomfortably, my grip tightening around the flashlight. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear them. I shifted my weight against the wall, feeling the rough concrete dig into my back, and sighed. "You're safe here," I said quietly, not expecting a response but feeling like I had to say something. The creature's gaze snapped back to me, and for a second, I thought I saw something almost grateful in its eyes. It pulled the blanket tighter around itself, huddling deeper into the corner, and I could see the tension in its thin shoulders slowly start to ease. I don't know how long we sat like that, the two of us in the dim basement, wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than it should have. The only sounds were the faint dripping of a pipe and the occasional creak of the old house above us. I glanced at the basement window, a tiny, dirty thing near the ceiling, and wondered if anyone else had ever seen it. If it had peeked out at the world, watching, waiting. Had it been trapped down here this whole time, afraid to come out? My thoughts were spiraling again, and I forced myself to focus. I needed to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just keep it hidden forever, but calling for help felt like a gamble I wasn't willing to take. What if they didn't help? What if they took it? The thought made my stomach churn, and for the first time I realized I wasn't just afraid for myself anymore. I was afraid for it. The stillness in the basement was broken by a sound that made my heart drop, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to set every nerve in my body on edge. The creature flinched violently, its whole body tensing as it clutched the blanket tighter around itself. Its eyes darted toward the tiny basement window, wide with what I could only describe as terror. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached, my mind racing with possibilities. The sound was unnatural, like nothing I'd ever heard before, and it felt like it was vibrating in my bones. I didn't dare move, afraid that whatever was causing it might somehow notice me. The creature let out a soft, clicking whimper, its gaze locked on the window as if it knew exactly what the sound meant. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than before, and I realized I was holding my breath. The creature's trembling eased slightly, but it didn't relax, its eyes still fixed on the window, as though it was waiting for something else to happen. I didn't dare ask what. Minutes passed. At least I think they did, though it felt like hours. The air in the basement felt heavier than ever, and every creak of the house made me jump. I wanted to ask the creature what that sound had been, what it was so afraid of, but the words caught in my throat. It was as if speaking would shatter the fragile balance we'd managed to create. Instead, I sat there, watching it watch the window, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a mistake bringing it food and water. Had I drawn attention to it, to myself? The thought made my skin crawl, and I felt a wave of regret wash over me. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and now it felt like I was in over my head. Finally, the creature shifted, its eyes flicking back to me for the briefest moment. There was something in its gaze, gratitude maybe, or resignation, but before I could figure it out, it pulled the blanket tighter and tucked itself into the corner, its body almost disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to say something, to reassure it, but I had nothing left. My mind was blank, my body numb, and all I could do was sit there, waiting for a sign that everything was going to be okay. And then, just like that, it was gone. I don't know how it happened. One moment, it was there, curled up in the corner, and the next, the space was empty. The blanket was still there, crumpled on the floor, but the creature had vanished without a sound. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight sweeping frantically across the basement, but there was no trace of it. The only thing left was the faint smell it had carried, that metallic, otherworldly scent that now seemed to linger in the air. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty corner, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Eventually, I forced myself to move, climbing the stairs in a daze and locking the basement door behind me. For days after, I avoided going down there, afraid of what I might or might not find. I told myself it was over, that whatever it had been, it was gone now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hum never returned, but sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint clicking sounds coming from the walls, so quiet I almost thought I was imagining them. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it came to me. All I know is that it was afraid, more afraid than I was, and that scares me more than anything else. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the night they watched USI. Still get chills just thinking about that night, and honestly, I don't even know where to start. We just installed the security cameras around the house a few weeks before. One of those decisions you make because you feel like it's the adult thing to do. You know, for peace of mind. It wasn't like we lived in a high-crime area or anything. Our neighborhood is quiet. Maybe a little too quiet sometimes. The kind of place where people wave to you while walking their dogs and neighbors borrow sugar from each other. So I wasn't expecting the cameras to catch anything worth reviewing, let alone something that would make me question reality itself. It started with a notification on my phone around 2:47 a.m. You know how you sometimes get those false alerts? Bugs flying too close to the lens, or maybe a stray cat triggering the motion sensor. I almost ignored it. I was half asleep, and the glow from my phone screen hurt my eyes. But for some reason, I tapped the notification anyway, and what I saw still haunts me. At first, it was hard to tell what I was looking at. The feed from the camera above our driveway was grainy, but there was something moving just at the edge of the frame. It wasn't a person. I could tell that much right away. Too tall, too stretched, if that makes sense. It looked like its limbs were bending in ways they shouldn't, almost fluid-like but jerky at the same time. And then it stepped fully into view. The thing was massive. Its head almost brushed the edge of the porch roof, and its body was impossibly thin, almost skeletal. But its skin, if you can even call it that, was a deep, oily black that seemed to absorb all the light from the camera. No eyes, no face, just this smooth, featureless surface where a head should be. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank. Someone in a weird suit messing around. But then it moved again, and the way it walked was unnatural. Its legs bent backward like a bird's, and it had this horrible slinking motion, almost like it was stalking something. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I rewound the footage, hoping I was imagining things. My heart was racing, and by now, I was wide awake. That's when I noticed it wasn't alone. Another one of those things stepped into the frame, then another. They moved in complete silence, communicating only by subtle, jerky gestures. I could see them pointing at the house, at my house. It felt like someone had dropped ice water into my veins. I nudged my husband awake, practically shoving the phone into his face. At first, he grumbled and waved me off, but when he saw the screen, all the color drained from his face. He whispered, "What the hell is that?" Like saying it louder would make them hear us through the walls. I wanted to believe that the footage was some kind of glitch, like the camera was malfunctioning and distorting normal people into those things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way they moved, the way their bodies looked, there was no mistaking it. These weren't people. While my husband kept staring at the phone, I got up and peeked out the bedroom window, trying to be as quiet as possible. From the angle of the street lamp, I could just barely make out the edge of the driveway. Nothing seemed out of place. No shadows, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. But when I looked back at the live camera feed, the creatures were there, right outside. I can't even explain the kind of fear that sets in when something like this happens. It's not like the fear you feel during a jump scare or even during a real-life danger like a car accident. This was deeper, more primal. My legs were shaking so badly I had to grip the windowsill to keep myself steady. Meanwhile, my husband was pacing now, mumbling about calling the cops, but I couldn't imagine how that would go. "Hello, 911? There are alien-looking things in my yard?" They'd think it was a joke. He was about to grab his phone to make the call anyway, when one of the creatures turned directly toward the camera. It didn't have eyes, but somehow I could feel it, looking. Its head tilted slightly, as if it knew it was being watched, and then it reached up with one of those impossibly long arms, its fingers, if you could call them that, curling in, ways that made my stomach turn. It was holding something. A long metallic object I couldn't identify, but it looked sharp, like a blade or a tool. My husband swore under his breath and backed away from the screen, muttering, "No way, no way, this can't be real." I didn't respond. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. What happened next made me realize how much trouble we were really in. One of the creatures stepped off the driveway and started moving toward the front door. Its movements were so slow and deliberate, almost like it was taunting us. The other two followed, staying just out of the camera's direct view, but close enough that I could see their shadows stretching across the porch. I swear, I could almost hear the floorboards creak, even though the footage was silent. That's when my phone vibrated again, a notification from the backyard camera. My stomach dropped. I switched feeds, and sure enough, there were two more of them standing by the back door. I couldn't breathe. 5 of them. They were surrounding the house. I felt completely trapped, like no matter where we tried to go, they'd already be waiting. My husband grabbed the baseball bat we kept under the bed, like that was going to make a difference. I didn't say anything, though. At that point, even holding on to something useless felt better than nothing. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, my phone still in my hand, flipping between the camera feeds. Front yard, backyard, side windows. No matter where I looked, there was something there. Those dark, towering figures closing in, moving slowly, like they had all the time in the world. And then it got worse. The camera in the backyard caught one of them stepping closer to the glass sliding door, its head tilted at an angle that almost seemed curious. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin, or whatever it was, looked rough, like cracked leather, and its fingers were ridiculously long, almost dragging across the ground as it moved. My husband whispered, "Do you hear that?" That's when I realized there was a sound coming from outside. A low, vibrating hum, just barely audible, but it made my ears ring and my chest feel tight. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the creatures themselves or from somewhere else, but it felt like it was inside me, crawling under my skin. We didn't have a plan. What could we even do? Call the cops and risk them showing up too late? Or worse, bringing attention to us? Run outside and hope we could somehow outrun them? The thought of leaving the kids upstairs flashed through my mind, and that's when I snapped into action. I ran out of the bedroom and headed straight for their room. My husband tried to stop me, whispering harshly that I should stay put, but there was no way I was leaving them alone. When I got to their room, they were both fast asleep. The sound wasn't as strong up there, but I could still feel that weird vibration in the air, like a pressure building up. I didn't want to wake them, not yet, so I just stood there for a second, listening for anything unusual. That's when I heard the faintest tap coming from the window. I froze, my eyes snapping to the curtains. The tapping came again, rhythmic but soft, like it wasn't trying to break the glass. Just remind me it was there. Slowly, I stepped closer and pulled back the curtain just an inch. There it was. One of those things, standing so close its elongated arms were brushing the window pane. Its head tilted, almost inquisitive, as if it could sense me behind the glass. I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the kids. My hands were shaking, and it felt like every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The thing didn't move, just stood there, its fingers trailing lazily across the glass, leaving faint, greasy smudges. It wasn't trying to get in, at least not yet. It was like it wanted me to know, it could, that it was in control. I grabbed my phone and switched back to the live feed. The front porch was empty now. The creatures had left the camera's view, but I knew they were still there, somewhere. The backyard camera showed one of them crouching low, its movements sharp and erratic, like it was scanning for something. It was almost worse not knowing exactly where they all were. That low hum was growing louder, and I could feel it vibrating in my teeth. My husband appeared in the doorway, his face pale, mouthing, "We have to go. Now." But as soon as he said it, there was a sound from downstairs. Not the hum, not tapping, this was something solid. A loud, deliberate thud. We both froze. The kids were still asleep, completely oblivious to what was happening. I couldn't decide if that was a blessing or a curse. My husband gripped the bat tighter and whispered, "Stay here." But I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. No way was I letting him go down there alone. We crept down the stairs together, every step feeling like it took an eternity. The hum seemed to follow us, growing heavier, almost like it was alive. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized the front door was wide open. I know for a fact we locked it before going to bed. The air felt icy, like all the heat had been sucked out of the house, and the hum was so loud now that it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. My husband motioned for me to stay back as he stepped toward the door, but then we both saw it. Just beyond the threshold, standing perfectly still, was one of the creatures. It wasn't moving, but its head twitched slightly, almost like it was reacting to us. Behind it, I could make out the shadows of more of them, stretching out into the street. They were just standing there, waiting. My husband froze in place, and for a moment, none of us moved. Us, the creature, or the ones lurking just beyond. It was like time had stopped, and all I could hear was that humming noise vibrating through my chest. The thing in the doorway tilted its head again, its featureless face locked on us. I couldn't tell if it was curious, amused, or angry. The only thing I knew for sure was that it wasn't human, and it didn't belong here. Then, without warning, it stepped inside, one long, deliberate stride. Its movements were horrifyingly fluid, like every bone in its body was double-jointed. My husband raised the bat instinctively, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't," I whispered. I don't even know why I said it. Maybe it was fear, or maybe some part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference. The thing turned its head toward the stairs, as if it knew the kids were up there. My stomach dropped. I couldn't let it go any further. I clenched my fists, trying to think of something, anything to stop it. That's when it did something I'll never forget. It reached out one of those long, twisted arms and touched the wall. Its fingers dragged across the surface, leaving behind these dark, oily streaks that almost seemed to sizzle against the paint. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt like my whole body was vibrating. My husband shouted, "Get out!" and took a step forward, but the creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned back toward us and stretched its arm out in our direction. I swear I could feel the air shift, like it was pulling something out of the room, out of us. Then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and everything went black. The hum stopped, just like that, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. I reached out blindly for my husband, gripping his arm as tight as I could. "Where is it?" I whispered, but he didn't answer. I could hear him breathing, quick and shallow, but there was no sound from the creature. For a moment I thought, maybe it had left, maybe they'd all left. But then came the worst sound of all, a slow, deliberate creak from the stairs. It was going up. I've never felt panic like that before. My legs moved before I even realized it, dragging my husband behind me as we stumbled toward the stairs. I could barely see, but I didn't care. I couldn't let it reach the kids. Every creak of the floorboards ahead of us made my stomach churn. The air felt suffocating, heavier with each step. That hum, it wasn't gone. It was faint now, but I could still feel it vibrating deep in my chest, like it was alive. As we climbed, I realized how quiet everything had gotten. The hum, the floorboards, even our breathing felt muffled, like sound itself was being pulled out of the house. When we reached the top, I saw it. The creature was standing in front of the kid's door. Its hand was on the knob, those long, spindly fingers curling around it like it was testing its weight. My husband moved past me, raising the bat again. But before he could swing, the creature did something that stopped both of us cold. It turned its head toward us, and for the first time, it reacted. It tilted its head all the way to one side, then snapped it back upright so quickly that it made my breath catch. Then it opened the door. No rush, no aggression. It just pushed it open, as if it had every right to be there. My heart sank. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My husband shouted and ran toward it, but the creature stepped inside the tomb, room and out of sight, disappearing into the darkness. He didn't hesitate, rushing in after it, but I froze. Something about the doorway felt wrong. It was like the shadows in the room were deeper than they should have been, almost alive, swirling and shifting in a way that made me dizzy. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I gripped the edge of the door frame and stepped inside, expecting to see chaos, screaming, something. But the room was silent. My husband was standing in the middle of it, staring at the kids who were still asleep, completely untouched. No sign of the creature. No shadows. Nothing. "Where is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My husband didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the kids, like he was in a trance. Then finally, he turned to me, his face pale. "It's gone," he said. But the way he said it, I didn't believe him. I stepped closer, looking around the room like I expected it to jump out of a corner or crawl out from under the bed. But there was nothing, just the kids, still sound asleep, completely oblivious. My husband kept saying it was gone, but his voice was shaking and his eyes wouldn't stop darting around the room. Something about the air still felt wrong, thick and heavy, like the hum had left a residue behind. Then I noticed the window. It was open just a crack. I was positive we'd locked it earlier that night. I always double-checked the kids' windows before bed. I walked over, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtain back. Outside, the yard was still. No shadows, no movement, just the faint glow of the street lamp spilling across the grass. But then I saw it. On the glass, smudged like fingerprints, were the same oily streaks I'd seen downstairs. I felt my stomach twist, and for a second I thought I was going to throw up. Whatever that thing was, it had been in the room, right there, standing over my kids. I don't know why it left, but I knew it wasn't because we scared it off. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We just sat in the kids' room, the bat still in my husband's hands, staring at the door like we were waiting for it to come back. The hum was gone, but the silence was almost worse. Every tiny sound, house creaks, branches brushing the windows, made me jump. By the time the sun started to rise, it felt like days had passed. For the first time, I let myself believe it might actually be over. But that hope didn't last long. When I went downstairs to check the cameras again, the footage from the night before was gone. Every file had been erased, like it had never existed. I tried to reset the system, but it was useless. I thought about calling the company, but what was I supposed to say? That my cameras had been hacked by something inhuman? As I sat there staring at the blank screen, my phone buzzed. It was another notification from the camera feed. I opened it, half expecting to see nothing at all. But there it was, live footage of our backyard. And in the far corner, just barely visible in the daylight, one of those figures was standing there, still, watching. I froze, staring at the screen, hoping I was imagining it. But it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. The figure was standing perfectly still, tall and shadow-like, blending almost seamlessly into the corner of the yard where the light didn't quite reach. It didn't move, didn't flinch, but I could feel its presence even through the grainy footage. My heart started racing again, that same cold dread spreading through my body. How could it still be there in broad daylight? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. I called for my husband, my voice shaky, and he came rushing into the room, his face pale and drawn from the sleepless night. "It's back," I whispered, pointing at the screen. He leaned in close, squinting at the feed, and for a moment, we both just stood there, staring. Then slowly, the figure tilted its head, just like before. My husband grabbed his phone to call someone, anyone, but before he could, the screen glitched. The feed froze for a split second, then went completely dark. We checked the yard immediately, but it was empty. No footprints, no streaks on the windows, nothing. It was like the figure had never been there at all, but we both knew what we'd seen. The rest of the day passed in a haze, every little noise, making us jump. We tried to act normal for the kids' sake, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, we didn't turn the cameras back on. We didn't sleep either, and for the next few days, nothing happened. No strange figures, no humming, no notifications. It was like the whole thing had been a bad dream. except for the oily marks still smeared across the walls and windows. We scrubbed them off, but even now, I swear I can still see faint traces of them when the light hits just right. We haven't seen the creature since, but the fear hasn't left. Every time I hear a strange noise or catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, my chest tightens, and I feel that hum again, just faintly, in the back of my mind. Whatever those things were, they wanted something, and I don't think they're done with us yet. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.